Barbarossa begins on 22 June 1941 as a blitzkrieg aimed at rapid conquest, with Germany deploying 3.2 million troops along an 1,800-mile front. While it appears on the surface to be a quick campaign, Nazi leaders had long planned a far darker agenda. Hitler's top-secret Führer Directive No. 21, 18 December 1940, instructed the Wehrmacht to prepare to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign, naming the USSR's defeat as the main war objective. Beneath this military strategy lay genocidal intent. Hitler's ideology, laid out in Mein Kampf, framed history as a struggle of superior Aryans versus inferiors, and included a long-standing vow to annihilate the Jewish race in Europe if war erupted. Nazi propaganda depicted Soviets, Slavs, and Jews alike as Untermenschen or subhumans, destined for destruction. For example, a Soviet Jewish family in June 1941, sensing a threat beyond the battlefield, learns of Hitler's hateful speeches and fears the fate awaiting their subhuman neighbors. From the 1920s onward, Hitler promoted a vision of Lebensraum and racial war, insisting that Germany needed living space in the East. He modeled this expansion on the U.S. Wild West, promising to exploit the USSR's vast resources and to expel or exterminate its peoples. In Mein Kampf and subsequent speeches, Hitler combined anti-Bolshevism with anti-Semitism, portraying the USSR as controlled by a Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. Notably, on 30 January 1939, he declared to the Reichstag that if war broke out, it would result in the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. These ideological positions became official policy. By late 1940, Himmler and his aides had drafted Generalplan Ost, the master plan for the East, which envisioned the Germanization of conquered Soviet territories and the removal of 30 to 40 million Slavic and other non-Aryans, most of whom were expected to perish. On 18 December 1940, Hitler signed Directive No. 21 for Operation Barbarossa, telling the OKH to get ready to crush Soviet Russia as Germany's main goal. John Delaney of the Imperial War Museum says that conquest of the USSR was Hitler's main war objective right from the start. The directive called for blitzkrieg, deep armored attacks and airstrikes to destroy the Red Army. And it even said that once the Volga-Archangel line was reached, the Luftwaffe should attack the last industrial centers in the Urals if needed. But importantly, Hitler's planners knew this military war was also based on race. The secret Barbarossa Decree, 13 May 1941, ordered German soldiers to treat any civilians who blocked the war effort as partisans and to shoot them immediately. Halder's own orders called for collective use of force against villages suspected of supporting guerrillas. This made it clear that the war in the East would not be a clean war. The German Army's Chief of Staff, Franz Halder, clearly ordered that if there were partisan attacks, entire villages were to be massacred. German infantry crosses a pontoon bridge over the Dnieper near Smolensk, summer 1941, showing Barbarossa's fast advance into Soviet territory. As the Wehrmacht moved east, Nazi racial policy shaped its supply plans. In May 1941, Germany's food planners, led by Herbert Backe, finished the Hunger Plan. They ordered the capture of Soviet grain supplies and sending them to Germany, knowingly causing mass famine. A wartime memo later said that Göring, Backe, and others talked openly of the systematic starving to death of 20 to 30 million Soviet citizens. Meanwhile, Generalplan Ost's maps, discussed by planners like SS leader Himmler, planned the forced relocation or removal of tens of millions of Slavs. In practice, German orders sent large food trains back to the west, leaving Soviet villages empty. In our story, we might show a Red Army commissar or a Ukrainian farmer watching grain shipments being taken away, a destroyed village with starving children. Even Wehrmacht officers recorded the expectation of mass deaths. Archival research at the Imperial War Museum notes that Nazi officials expected the systematic starving to death of 20 to 30 million Soviet citizens. Diaries and letters from 1941 show that soldiers quickly understood the war's brutality. For example, German commanders became involved in these actions. One divisional officer wrote home in August 1941 that the Bolshevik hordes were subhumans driven into a frenzy, and he praised Hitler for saving Europe. Army medical officers reported treating thousands of starving POWs. More than 2 million Soviet prisoners would die because of deliberate neglect. A captured German diary, for example, Eastern Inferno by soldiers, or a Soviet civilian journal could be quoted describing how people were simply left to die once the front line moved on. By the summer of 1941, the connection between military strategy and ideology was clear. Territories captured at the front of Barbarossa were immediately planned for German settlement, and official policy supported killing millions of Soviet civilians through starvation or execution. Even though there was growing evidence, a huge German troop buildup, and Allied reports about Hitler's speeches, Stalin refused to believe that Hitler planned a total war. British intelligence warned that an attack was coming soon, but Stalin reportedly dismissed these warnings as British tricks to pull the USSR into the war. As one historian explains, Hitler's decision was based on a racial life-or-death belief, yet Stalin's blindness to this ideology left him unprepared. In fact, Stalin received many clear warnings in 1940-41. Some estimates say 87 warnings, but because he did not trust Western agents, he ignored most of them. Soviet civilians who had been told to evacuate or get ready were left where they were. Some Wehrmacht officers felt uneasy about the harsh policies. For example, Army Group commanders like Field Marshal von Lieb privately worried that widespread shootings of Jews and civilians would lead to partisan war and weaken discipline. In mid-1941, Rundstedt, Lieb, and others even asked Hitler to limit SS killings in the rear areas. However, Hitler rejected all objections. For example, on 6 June 1941, Hitler insisted on the infamous Commissar Order, which required Soviet political commissars to be shot. And on 13 May, he signed the Barbarossa Decree, removing punishment for crimes against civilians. In diaries, we could show Halder or others writing entries like, "Orders leave no doubt, this is total war," showing their moral shock. The Wehrmacht's chief lawyer, General Müller, told judges that in the East, one adversary must be finished off, directly encouraging troops to eliminate civilians. By late 1941, the true nature of Barbarossa could no longer be ignored. German casualties increased, more than 750,000 dead by winter 1941. And soldiers on both sides understood the ideological brutality of the war. A German POW or a Soviet partisan letter might describe the horror they saw: mass shootings, constant hunger, and even children being shot after being accused of feeding partisans. Also, by autumn 1941, Nazi leaders openly defined their goals for victory. Conquered Soviet territories were to be Germanized, and millions of inferior Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians were intentionally to be starved or shot. In other words, what some leaders had hoped would be a normal military campaign was now clearly shown to be a genocidal crusade.
This episode shows that from day one, Barbarossa was connected to Nazi racial policy, not just a risky military move. Hitler's own speeches and orders made the conquest of the Soviet Union a racial crusade. The plans and orders made by his planners, from the Hunger Plan to General Plan Ost, all expected the mass killing of non-Aryans. The paradox disappears. Barbarossa was never only a failed blitzkrieg, but a planned war of destruction. We end by suggesting that this violent ideology will shape the entire Eastern campaign, leading into future episodes about the Holocaust and the brutal occupation.